All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. Welcome to Crazy Talk. For those of you who have talked before, Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where we interview people about all sorts of things related to mental health. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. Again, I'm your host, Lee Thomas, and I'm really excited for this week's episode. This week's episode is going to be absolutely amazing. I'm getting, hopefully, a redemption shot, my chance to re-interview the amazing advocate, Rudy Caseres. So Rudy is an award-winning public speaker, writer, and Facebook Live host. He advocates for humane treatment in the mental health care system and effective suicide prevention. He is the host of No Restraints with Rudy Caseres, where he interviews mental health advocates every Friday on his Facebook page. In addition, for This Is My Brave every Wednesday, as well as a monthly Facebook Live for the Mighty, stays very busy. His content has also been featured on Healthy Place, OC87, Recovery Diaries, Project You Are Okay, Sweatpants and Coffee, Wear Your Label, and Mad in America. Rudy has proudly lived in San Pedro, Los Angeles, California. Life. Rudy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, it is 8:30 a.m. Pacific time, but you know what? When I was talking to you before we went live, I was like super low energy, but I'm going to take that mask off and I'm going to have lots of energy. I'm going to be okay because I'm glad to be on Crazy Talk with Lee Thomas. It's great to be on the other side of the on the other side of the split screen. So it's great to be on
the other side of the other end of the camera.
Yes. I hope we're doing okay. Hopefully you can see me to the viewers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping our technology works out. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to be moving to Calgary in about a week. And for those of you who are watching who are like, Calgary, where is that? That's where the big old rodeo. Clearly the only reason why I'm going there. And so I'm hoping that we're going to have better internet when I live there. Fingers crossed. But Rudy, assuming our internet holds up, which I am hoping it will. I know you really like to start off your podcast and your Facebook Live episodes with a really tough question, which is like, so tell us a little bit about who is Rudy Caseres?
I don't know. Next question.
Next question, please. I'm off. Show's over. What I really like to do. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, Rudy Caseres. Well, I contain multitudes, but I've lived in San Pedro, Los Angeles, California my entire life, except for a short stint in the U.S. Army, which led to a mental breakdown, which led to all kinds of other fun things. But I started sharing my story. I rose from the ashes, and now I'm doing public speaking. I'm speaking at a conference in Phoenix, Arizona next week. I do the Facebook Lives, kind of like you. I have No Restraints on my page, facebook.com/Rudy Caseres. And I also work with This Is My Brave, which is a mental health nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. They put on these storytelling events, and I host a show called Brave Chat Live every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, where I interview different people involved with that organization, past storytellers, producers, you name it. And I'm also producing the Los Angeles show this September. So if you're in that area, please, or if you're like Lee Thomas, who agreed to fly out here before we went live, let me know. So I got all these things going on.
Anytime. You want to get me out of the frozen tundra? Anytime.
You got it. So I got all these things going on. I also work with the Mighty. I do Facebook Lives for them. I occasionally write, very, very occasionally. But all these things come together to make the stereotypical mental health advocate.
Oh, I like the idea of the stereotypical advocate. I don't think I've heard that one before.
You got the mental health advocate starter kit. So you get like an Instagram with inspirational quotes. You get like a profile on the Mighty, and you give like a couple speeches with NAMI, and you're good to go.
And so that's hilarious to me, first of all, because I think that a lot of the advocacy work that happens, and maybe this is a Canadian thing, I don't know, a lot of the advocacy work that happens sometimes feels like it happens very independently to end up developing the same sort of things.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I like to think that it's at least people are getting their feet wet, getting in the water, and then eventually, if they're game for it, they go into the deep end. The trick is to get everyone to at least dip their toes in the water as far as being a mental health advocate, and then you can evolve from there. So I look back on some of my early mental health related posts, and I'm like, oh my God, like what was I thinking? Like now I'm, I guess to say, more woke than I first was, but I'm constantly learning, and I'm not afraid to go into the deep end now because here I am on Crazy Talk, where the tough questions get asked. There's no running away. Crazy Talk, Lee Thomas.
So I do want to touch on that a little bit because you often in your blog posts and in your Facebook posts, you really don't shy away from like controversy, I guess. You know what I mean? You are really stating your opinion, and you're open to saying the things that need to be said, or saying the things that other people aren't saying. A post in I think it was in March about how you didn't want to be cured of your bipolar disorder, and that got a big reaction on the do you want to talk about that a little bit, and kind of, I guess, both that blog post as well as your just kind of, not being afraid to shy away from stating your true opinion?
Well, I recently discovered actually that you can cure bipolar with snakes, so I tried that and I'm good to go. I recommend your audience just try snakes to be cured of bipolar.
God, Rudy. I feel like it's like where here we go. I feel like someone should say, no, you can't cure bipolar disorder with snakes. The one thing I asked you not to say, Rudy.
The thing is that I used to want to be cured because that's what I was told by people. Like, oh, you don't want this brain disease, this awful thing. Like, you want your life back. You want to live a normal, healthy life. And I could understand the reasoning for that because bipolar oftentimes can suck. But I like to think that that's more acceptance issue, an accessibility issue, and accommodation issues. Is that oftentimes people with bipolar, we treat them like crazy people when they just view the world from a different lens. They can experience reality in different ways, and sometimes bipolar can affect them in ways that are negative. That's being honest, but it doesn't mean that bipolar in and of itself is this evil thing. It can be managed, and it can have its advantages. And just like anything else, there's good, there's bad, but it's part of me, and I don't want to change me. I don't want to be a different person because that's what it'd be without the bipolar. I'd be a completely different Rudy.
Yeah, and that was something that I thought was really interesting because I asked a question on Twitter, and I did like one of those Twitter polls. And this was at a health-related conference where people with all sorts of health issues, both physical and mental health issues, were in attendance. And so I basically said, if you have never experienced your health issue, would you? And I found that people with physical health issues often were like, yeah, if I could go back, I would not experience my health issue. But I found, and this is, just in general, but I found that there's aspect, but it's really influenced and changed who I am as a person. And I don't know who I would be without it, right? Like if maybe your health made you a more compassionate person, or maybe it made you, a more outgoing, or like whatever it might be, there's something about it that, kind of changes us a little bit.
Yeah, and I've asked this question to people with chronic illnesses, progressive illnesses, bipolar, schizophrenia, OCD, and for the most part, not always, people wouldn't want to be cured or live a different life. And especially when I talk to people who are, say, in a wheelchair or blind, they're totally fine because as long as we have accessibility, which we don't always have everywhere, I get that. But if we can live in a world with accessibility, with accommodations for different people, different experiences, different bodies, um, the world would be a better place for everyone, but especially for people who've been historically discriminated against for being different. And that's where I hope we're headed. But it's so weird that if someone was in a wheelchair and they said like, no, I'm fine, I got my wheelchair, everything's good to go, I don't want my legs to be functioning the way that other people do. I was going to say functioning right, but that's kind of ableist in itself. But when you say that to someone with bipolar or OCD, and they say like the same exact thing, you think they're crazy. You think like, oh my God, like that must be their illness talking. You know, when I wrote that piece for the Mighty, the number one type of comment is that he must have been manic when he wrote this, because no sane person, no person in their own right mind would want to stay bipolar.
And so, do you find that people, I guess, anytime we talk about the upsides, I guess, if we're being realistic, some of the upsides of having bipolar disorder, because don't get me wrong, like I'm not sure where I fall on the I would take that pill that cures me. You know what I mean? I'm not sure what I would do in that situation, because I'm not a huge fan of the depression part. But do you find that when you talk about any of the upsides, people are like, oh, well, you must be you like that just proves that you're mentally ill, right? Because like you just said, no one in their right mind could possibly want to be different in any way.
Yeah, it's like the same thing when I speak about hospitals. People think like, "Oh, that's just your illness talking because don't you want help?" And that's a different thing for a different topic. But yeah, no, it's just weird how that works, and I would get it. And I would say the thing about depression is that yes, depression sucks for the most part, but at least for me, it makes me a more empathetic person. It gives me more time to reflect, and I will say this is that it makes me have a more realistic interpretation of the world. And I know there's this whole concept of that depression is a lie, but I oftentimes it's because I see the world for it is. The world can be a very depressing place. There's a lot to be depressed about. And I'm honest with it, with myself. And I'm not going to let it defeat me. I'm not going to take my life because of it. I want to keep fighting. But yeah, the world is a depressing place. And for me to acknowledge that and to validate it, I don't think that's such a bad thing.
Yeah, and that's like there's so much to unpack there, which I really am really excited about, because I think that really goes against the advocacy work that a lot of people are doing right now. Is that something that you find that like you're kind of in many ways kind of swimming against the current in terms of the way that mental health advocacy has that been your experience? Do you find that other advocates are like, Rudy, what are you doing?
Yeah, because first I was when I first started, I was totally on board with the talking points. Didn't want to rock the boat, and I had a lot of friends, a lot of supporters. And then I started talking about these things, and I started getting a lot more pushback. People would unfollow me, people would block me, and that's okay because for every time that happens, I get people emailing me that I didn't even know out of the blue saying that you talking about this, talking about forced hospitalization, talking about not wanting to be cured for bipolar has really opened my eyes, or I agreed with you, and I've never found anyone to really speak up about these things so publicly. So that to me makes it worth it. I think mainstream mental health advocacy focuses more on recovery and learning to, I guess, to rejigger our minds to see it in a more positive outlook. Whereas I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I want to live my best life, but I also want to call out discrimination when it's there. I want to call out things that are depressing and that do cause people to take their lives because it's not just, oh, people just need to reframe and to think more positive and to see the world in the best light. No, the world oftentimes sucks. People often suck. And it's not always the person's fault that they're depressed, that they're suicidal, that they're manic, that they're hearing voices they don't want to hear. It's oftentimes the fault of other people. It's the fault of society. And we're not talking enough about that. We're putting the blame on ourselves, on our brains, on our experiences, when that is not the case most of the time.
Yeah, and I find that that's something that, like, if we look, in a really broad kind of sense of time, a lot of mental health issues as being kind of purely social. We thought that you got mental illness because you were sinful and because you were a bad person and because, whatever. And now the pendulum has kind of swung all the way to the other direction, where we see mental illness as something very biological in a lot of advocacy and in a lot of kind of the current conversation. So we start having these conversations about, like, oh, I can pinpoint that part in your DNA where you're going to get bipolar disorder or whatever it might be, without talking about, like, all the social stuff that went along with it, right? And I agree. I think that we're missing out on a huge chunk of the conversation. It's kind of like that saying where if all the frogs in a pond are sick, you don't say, what's wrong with these frogs? What's wrong with, right?
Yeah, my favorite quote is, "Birds born in a cage think flying is an illness."
Ooh, I've never heard that one before. I'm going to be thinking on that one for a while. So I did want to talk a little bit, because you're very outspoken about the issue of forced hospitalization. And I think that that's something that maybe a lot of my viewers might not be particularly familiar with, because I think a lot of the time, again, the narrative that we're given is like, people are sick and they should be in the hospital. So do you want to talk a little bit about that issue?
Yeah, I think when people have a choice, if they want to be hospitalized, it can make the outcome better, because oftentimes they want to be, I guess, locked up. They see it as being, other people can't get in, either because of dangers or perceived dangers, or just wanting to get away from a toxic situation. Whereas me, who was hospitalized involuntarily, did not want to leave their home, did not want to leave their environment, and was just placed in here, feeling like a prisoner, put in restraints, forcibly catheterized, like forced to do all these things that they don't want to do, just because they were feeling sad, just because they didn't want to talk to anyone at a time, just because they weren't wanting to engage. And that is just not the right way to go to help people. Oftentimes people are suicidal, or just having suicidal thoughts. I had a friend who was in the emergency room and asked if she was suicidal, and she said no, but like, sometimes I wish like I can just walk into traffic and maybe get hit by a truck. She's put in the hospital, can't even give a graduation speech for her college, and just changes her whole life forever. And that's not okay. That's one of those things, those adversities, where I wish I didn't happen. People come up to me who are pro forced treatment and saying, like, well, isn't it a good thing that you were put in the hospital, because now you can be this mental health advocate? And it's no. What I say is that you wouldn't tell someone who's an advocate for domestic violence and say, like, well, wasn't it good that you were actually beaten by your spouse, because now you get to be this advocate? So that's how I feel on forced hospitalization, is that when you use force, when you use coercion, you take people's choices away, people's liberty, then I don't understand how that's still seen as a good idea for helping people.
Yeah, and it's not a topic I'm incredibly well versed in, to be totally honest, because but I think it revolves around something that I've really been processing in my head for a long time, which is this idea of choice, right? This idea that people with mental health issues either should or should not have certain choices. And that's come up not super recently, but in the past, like, couple years, it's been a big topic in Canada, specifically around like the topic of assisted dying, right? Because that's now been legalized for a kind of, I'm like degenerative physical illnesses. I'm not sure of the exact right wording for it. And there's this big conversation happening. Like, should people with chronic mental health issues also have access to this service? And a lot of people are very divided on this topic. And I am still working through a lot of my feelings about it, but I feel like it's got to be tied in with that issue of choice in some way. Is that a conversation that's being had with the circles of advocates that you're in?
Yeah, like even the American Association of Suicidology, which I'm not a member of, but I often support their cause, is they had a big stance that they support assisted suicide, except for in the cases of mental illness. And I disagree with that. I think that if someone has been in despair for years and years and years and goes through the same process, which is not an easy or short process to qualify for assisted suicide, then they should have that right. That is their right. I mean, I don't like this idea that we should just be these guardian angels and just like save people from depths of their despair, and not do anything else with that. Okay, you got the person off the bridge. What are you going to do next? Oftentimes, nothing. You just let them go on with their life, and they're probably going to end up doing it again. You're not solving anything by just getting someone off the ledge. There's so much to do as far as suicide prevention, but that's another thing I could talk about for days probably. But as far as having the right to take our own lives in a controlled manner, even having our friends and family around us, and making, I guess, a ceremony out of it, why not? Why not? I think oftentimes we think that a person who has a mental illness can't make their own decisions. And I mean, like, what if me, what if someone said you can't do this or that because you have this diagnosis? I mean, you and I, like, look at all the stuff that we're able to do. We might not have been able to do that at one point in our life, but it goes to show is that someone may be seen as quote unquote severely mentally ill, not having capacity, not having insight, but we can make it through. And if we can't, that should be an option. That's just my stance, but I'm not alone in that.
And it's one of those things where it's I've the whole way that I kind of reached my thinking around this, and my thinking around it is still pretty fluid. Like I'm still negotiating it, but you articulated a good number of the things. And for me, a lot of it comes down to like, that's a right that I want to have for myself if I'm ever in the situation to need it. And if it's a right that I want for myself, it has to be a right that I want for other people. Even if in my mind, I'm like, I don't, like, I'm not comfortable with all the implications of it, but if I want it for me, I have to want it for other people, right? Like, it's only fair.
Yeah, and it goes back to like, just because it makes you uncomfortable doesn't give you the right or anyone else the right to take that right from other people, especially when other people have it. When you single out people for rights and you don't give them the same rights as others, then that's not a world I want to live in.
Yeah, and it's very strange to me that like a lot of mental health organizations have spent so much time saying mental illnesses are real, they're just as real as physical illnesses, they're real. And then when it comes to an issue like this, sometimes take a half step back and go like, they're real, but they are always recoverable. You know what I mean? Which it just, I'm not, yeah, I would love to believe that that's entirely sure that it always would be for me.
Yeah, and no, you're right, and that should be your decision. That shouldn't be your parents saying, "No, you'll get better. Just keep at it," or whatever. Or you're sick, but you're too sick to make your own decision. So we're gonna keep you alive for as long as we want to. That's not gonna work either. And I just not a big fan of that word recovery for so many different things because I recovery, I mean, to me, that means that I'm no longer have the same attributes of bipolar, even the ones that I find meaning in. And I don't want that. I don't want that. I don't get like that whole term recovery, why it's so prevalent everywhere you look for in mental health advocacy. I'm okay with still being depressed, with still being manic to an extent, to even still having suicidal thoughts. That's just who I am. Like me without adversities, that's boring. That's just someone with just way too much privilege. And like, who's gonna listen to someone, who's gonna take someone seriously who just has no adversity in their life? Like, do you come across people like that? It's like, dude, like, you have never lived a day in your life, so like, that must be so sad.
Well, what I think is really interesting around kind of the word of recovery is because I am like my introduction and a lot of my background is through the eating disorder world, right? And in the eating disorder world, we do really, really preach recovery, right? Just kind of the MO of every single eating disorder thing I've ever encountered, right? Sometimes we talk about like, partial recovery and is that okay and blah blah blah, but there's just kind of this like, I guess, like very the whole entire paradigm is built around recovery. But then when I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which is very much a chronic condition, the idea of recovery changed for me a lot, right? The idea of recovery no longer became like, oh, like, it's an eating disorder and I don't want to have it anymore. Like, recovery became like, oh, so what exactly to change for me to be considered recovered? And I see that in a lot of peer support like criteria, because peer support is kind of really, really growing in Canada when it comes to mental health. And a lot of the times in peer support criteria, you have to be, quote, in recovery for at least 2 years. And it's like, well, what does that look like for someone with a chronic condition?
Yeah, and I will say the difference between eating disorder and mental health is usually, as far as recovery, is that you have a persistent pattern of self-harm, which either would be binging or purging or both. Similar to, although not the same as, self-harm, cutting for someone to deal with their mental health issues. And like, you don't want someone to just constantly cut when there are other ways to find coping skills, other ways to cope. But if that's the only way that someone can cope in that moment, we shouldn't treat them as a bad person, because that's not really their failing. That's the failing of society. So same thing, I don't want to advocate for anything that can be considered self-harm, but oftentimes that might be the only tool at their disposal for that person to have some kind of relief in their life. And I don't want to judge that person harshly. And thinking about all the things that I've done to drown away my pain and all of the unhealthy and unsafe decisions I've made in my life. I mean, shoot, just driving on the freeway in Los Angeles is very unsafe. So I don't want to be so judgmental of people who are engaging in other activities that would be considered harmful and unsafe as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I wish we had like a whole hour to talk about all the amazing stuff that we judged up. So we're going to have to definitely have you back on the show, hopefully when my internet is better. But that actually brings us to kind of the end of our time. So for the folks who are watching who are like, oh my goodness, Rudy is amazing, I definitely want to find out more about what he's getting up to. Where can people find out more?
Cool. First off, do we get any comments or questions?
Oh, we do have a lovely comment from Ina Winkleman. Thank you for making the word cover. Yes, awesome. And then Gabriella showed up. Hey, Gabriella, thank you so much for tuning in.
Gabriella's a super fan. Yeah. She follows me everywhere. Once again, my name is Rudy Caseres, and I host my own show like this, but worse, called No Restraints with Rudy Caseres, Fridays at 12 p.m. Pacific time, which I guess is 4 hours before Atlantic time. I'm actually having a special episode because I'm giving the keynote speech in Phoenix, Arizona next Friday, but this coming Tuesday at 12 p.m. Pacific, I'll be talking to someone you may know, Mark Hennick, who is another Canadian mental health superstar, and he's promised that we're going to talk about the controversial stuff, the stuff that other shows don't talk about, except for No Restraints and Crazy Talk, because we go there. So, and I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at Rudy Caseres. The name should be somewhere right here, but it's RudyCaseres, and you can go to rudycaseres.com to learn more about me and to get all the links. There's even a contact form where you can email me, and if you go to the No Restraints section, you can see all past episodes of No Restraints in reverse chronological order. If you live in Los Angeles, find me. Come say hi. I will travel wherever you want to meet with you and talk mental health.
Oh my goodness. So that's certainly a lot to tune into. And I really encourage everyone to do it because there are so many interesting conversations that you're having. And I'm really excited to see that conversation between you and Mark. That's going to be fantastic. So Rudy, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. I feel like we've talked about a lot of really interesting things and I've really loved it. If you're Crazy Talk and you're going, wow, Crazy Talk is really cool, I'd like to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list. I will put a link to that in the comments, or you can go to leethomas.ca and a little pop-up will show up that says join our mailing list, and you can do it there. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you again, Rudy, for being on the show, and we will see you next week at 12:30 Atlantic time for our next episode. Bye, everyone.